It was alarming to look at.
I just mouthed, "What the hell is that?"
He was wasting away.
There are 3 medical professionals in the room, and all 3 of them were completely at a loss.
We were in for something here that nobody was quite ready for.
Hello, and welcome to Something's Killing Me. I'm B.D. Wong. Dr. Bill Linder, a healthy, athletic 43-year-old physician, collapses just hours after returning home from a family trip overseas. It's the first sign that something is very wrong. When he seeks help, the answer is disturbing. The first doctors to treat him remark that his illness is something they'd never seen before. And the truth is, this disease is so rare, almost no one had.
It was 1990. It was over the summer, and we'd just gone on this family trip to Israel.
What's next on the agenda?
I was around 19, and my sister was around 17.
It's just beautiful up here. It's really nice and spiritual.
When we got back, everyone sort of retired to different parts of the house. My dad was tired, so he took a nap. My sister and I were in the basement.
And all of a sudden, we hear a crash upstairs. I ran upstairs, and I saw my dad just lying there, bleeding from the head, and it scared me to death.
It was terrifying. He had gashed his head.
I screamed at my sister to call 911, and she was in a panic.
My sister realized I wasn't going to be very helpful, so she jumped up and ran to the phone and called 911. And I sat there with him. I remember looking at his eyes, and they almost looked sort of glossy, like not seeing, and I had never seen him like that.
He seemed to come back, and we picked him up and got him to the bed, and he immediately did tell us to cancel the ambulance. He was a physician. He called his nurse, Kim, to come and stitch him up.
I remember he had incredible shortness of breath. And I was thinking that he captured something from being in Israel, that, he had gone to the desert. Maybe he got something when he was there.
It turns out that being on the long flight, his legs had gotten very swollen, and he had been taking medication for that.
He told us he took a water pill on the flight, and he said when he stood up after his nap, blood had rushed to his head and he had just passed out. So it seemed plausible. He got 11 or 12 stitches, and he went back to bed, and we thought everything was going to be fine. It wasn't until later we were able to figure out that this is something that's connected to something much bigger. Along with the swelling, he had other symptoms as well.
I was convinced that he needed to be checked out. He was having increasing symptoms of shortness of breath, and it was affecting the way that he was working.
Now, prior to all this, Bill started to notice that he had ankle swelling, and ankle swelling can be a sign of heart disease. So Bill didn't talk to anyone about this, but he went and saw a cardiologist to make sure that everything was okay.
And everything was functioning really well, so nobody had a real reason to be concerned about the swelling.
Bill didn't have time for any kind of illness. None of us knew that he was taking water pills.
His mother, my grandmother, had pretty swollen ankles for most of my life.
So that was just something that was, just part of the family, that you just kind of take water pills if you have some fluid in your legs.
But the swelling didn't go away, and it only got worse. But it wasn't just, airplane swell or even heat swell or even from being on your feet. It was actually a lot more extensive than that. I remember my father just come home from work and he was taking off his socks. And his leg was almost like a bone down from his knee, but then at his knee up, it was actually like this very big swollen knee. Alarming to look at.
I was wondering if Bill had a solitary kidney, and could that be what was happening with the swelling in his legs and the shortness of breath?
But they did testing, and then they found that Bill had 2 kidneys, and both of them were working just fine.
What was happening there? What was happening to this man who was so physically fit and so healthy?
Whoa, looks good, Billy. Looks good, Billy. All right.
He prided himself on being a great softball player.
Hey, captain of the team, you want to be in an interview?
He also wrote a record album. Decided he wanted to have a garage band, so he took bass lessons out of nowhere.
Professionally, he was really committed. He had his own practice as a family doctor.
We tend to be the friends of the patients, and we send our friends to Doctor's Hospital.
His clinic was really very busy. They would see as many as 200 patients a day. But all the patients loved him, they adored him, they trusted what he said, they even named kids after him. So he was a terrific doctor.
Over the next year and a half after he fell at the top of the stairs, his body was steadily declining.
His energy level changed. He couldn't participate in sports.
I do think he was concerned, and I do think he was hiding it.
During this time, he was still working, but his energy was definitely flagging.
Doctors, ironically, are not always the best patients. I mean, we often think that we can manage our own symptoms and give ourselves treatment.
And then everything went haywire.
He was in one of the exam rooms, sitting in a chair. He could not breathe and said, "You're going to have to go get your car and take me to the emergency room."
When they got into the emergency room, and this is the hospital where he worked, so everybody knew him, brought him back immediately. And the first thing that they did was x-ray to see what was happening in his lungs. And they saw that they were filled with fluid, and it was completely bizarre.
The diagnosis was a pleural effusion. Now, a pleural effusion is essentially when fluid builds up in a layer right outside the lungs, a layer that normally doesn't have a lot of fluid in it.
There was no reason that this fluid should be there. So they did a procedure called tapping, which is basically like what you do to a maple tree. You tap it. It's fluid under pressure you're pulling out of the body.
I noticed what was going into the bottles, what kind of fluid it was. I just mouthed, "What the hell is that?" We were in for something here that nobody was quite ready for.
"45-year-old father and physician Bill Linder was suffering from unusual swelling in his lower body and difficulty breathing. He was rushed to the ER, where doctors used a procedure called tapping to remove excess fluid from his lungs. No one expected what happened next.
I knew immediately that we were in for something here that nobody was quite ready for.
There are 3 medical professionals in the room, and all 3 of them were completely at a loss. They pulled out liters and liters of this lemon chiffon-colored fluid that's sort of thick and milky.
The best I can describe was lemon meringue pie. So we knew that that was something that neither one of us had ever seen. The fluid drained off was about 5,000 cc's, which is 5 quarts. And that was a lot of fluid for anybody to hold within their lung area.
They had no idea how this fluid could be accounted for in his body cavity. Didn't make any sense.
Bill's reaction was one of relief. He could breathe. They were going to send off the fluid investigated to see what it was containing. He was sent home, to recuperate at home until the results of those tests came in. And one of their good friends, Jackie Schulman, came to pick him up.
That was the first time I would say that I noticed any nervousness or scaredness out of Bill.
When doctors tested the fluid, they saw that it had a high fat and protein content. So they called it a chylous effusion. Now, normally chyle is a fluid that goes from your digestive tract to your circulation. In Bill's case, it wound up in a place it's not supposed to be, around his lungs.
It was a mystery of what was happening to him.
Bad things just didn't really happen to us. We were this typical family in the 1990s in the suburbs of Ohio. A mom, dad, 2 kids. We sort of had this sort of all-American, very normal upbringing.
Hi guys.
Our family was extremely close.
My mom stayed at home with us. She was a teacher. My parents both came to all of our performances from the time we were little kids, all of our sports.
Even though my father worked a lot of hours, he always was a family guy. So when he was home, he was home. He was with his family.
For my whole life, my dad was so healthy, but he wasn't always healthy.
Earlier in his life, he had had another health crisis.
When my dad was 12, he had open heart surgery for what he always called a sticky flap.
The official diagnosis was pulmonary valve stenosis. Now, in this condition, there's actually a narrowing in the outlet of the right side of the heart. So there's kind of an obstruction when blood tries to flow from the right side of the heart to the lungs. And when patients have this, doctors can actually hear a murmur or a whoosh in the heart.
He actually had this scar from his neck to his navel that he was almost proud of it. But his heart was totally fine. All the tests came back negative. My father had had swelling in his legs, but around this time, it started to move up into his abdomen, and that's when things got really complicated.
He was thin, but yet had the distended stomach, looking like he was 9 months pregnant.
Doctors already knew that Bill had fluid around his lungs, and now that he had fluid around his abdomen, it was really a race to find out why. Because fluid buildups in these areas can really be a symptom of a much larger problem.
The doctors didn't know what was happening. Doctors would say, no, there's nothing wrong with your lungs. There's nothing wrong with your heart. Nothing wrong with your liver. So it was like, there was nothing wrong with anything, but there was something really wrong.
Now the fluid wasn't collecting in his lungs, it was collecting in his abdomen. And he required a paracentesis, which is the tapping of the abdomen to get rid of the fluid.
And the thing that you have to also consider is that when you're leaking fats and protein, you're not digesting it. So on top of my father having this incredibly complicated issue of swelling in his body, he wasn't really digesting food very well.
All of the nutrient-rich proteins and other metabolites that we require to live were being siphoned out with this fluid that he was leaking.
And because of all of this, Bill was starting to lose weight and get malnourished, even though he was still eating.
So we were trying to figure out different ways of making sure he got his nutrients. One of the ways that was the one that we probably used for the longest was an IV drip directly into his veins.
As Bill's body is filling up with fluid, doctors have to keep tapping him, meaning they're taking fluid out of his body. And they keep doing this, but it doesn't seem to be helping him.
Doctors would open him up, do exploratory surgery. It just didn't look good. And they were afraid to do too much. So they would shut him back up and say, I'm sorry, Bill, we don't know what's wrong with you. And we'd leave with no answers.
Rhoda and Bill were going to every hospital they could, seeking out different opinions.
He went to Arizona, he went to Brigham and Women's in Boston, Deaconess in Boston. He was all over, just looking for the diagnosis.
My mother was an amazing partner to my father through all of this. She was really his caregiver and his friend, having to focus so much energy on this very sick, very scared person. During one of his exploratory surgeries, a doctor did discover that he had a blockage in his portal vein.
The portal vein carries blood to your liver from the pancreas, spleen, gastrointestinal tract, and other parts of the intestine. It's a major vascular pathway for your liver, and any blockage or obstruction of the portal vein can lead to a backup in the system and disastrous, sometimes life-threatening consequences.
My dad underwent a procedure to repair it, but it didn't work, and like everything else, they didn't know why.
Each time that Rhoda and Bill went to a new facility, there was always that hope that that would be the answer, that they would find out what was going on. But nothing changed. He still had to go and get tapped.
He's faced with this inability to discern what was happening to him. And trust me, this man was intelligent. So I'm sure that the mystery of it all, it was more of a burden for him.
Then, in 1994, my dad's Aunt Joni dropped a bombshell.
I took one look at Billy, and I knew.
By 1994, Dr. Bill Linder had been suffering from a mystery illness for more than 2 years. His symptoms: shortness of breath, fluid in his lungs, abdominal swelling, and malnutrition. He was dying, and the doctors had no answers. But could a hunch from a determined family member finally solve the mystery?
My great Aunt Joni was my father's aunt. And from the time my dad started to be in the hospital for long periods of time, Aunt Joni was always showing up. It wasn't until my dad had been sick for probably a couple of years that I realized her own personal investment in my father's illness and why she wanted to be so present.
Joni had married Bill's uncle, his mother's brother, Nathan Linder. They had married in 1956. But just 2 years later, Nathan became ill at the age of 31.
He found that my husband had a slight murmur. Nothing, he was pretty sure it didn't really mean anything. So they ordered an X-ray. It showed that he had accumulated fluid in the chest.
I can't imagine that my aunt didn't just look at my dad and know immediately. It was probably terrifying.
At Montefiore Hospital, they decided to do surgery on him. Opened his chest, checked the heart. Everything came back normal. He was sick, but there was no clue as to what was making him sick.
The doctors were so puzzled about what was wrong that they sent him to the National Institutes of Health.
We spent 9 months at the NIH, and they could find nothing wrong with him. They were tapping this chylous fluid from him. He was wasting away.
Like Bill, Nathan had basically been starving to death. Nothing Nathan's doctors did seemed to be making a difference.
He died when he was 34. He drowned in his own fluid. They weren't getting the fluid out fast enough. There were autopsies done. The reports were nothing.
She, at the time, had a toddler who was 4 and a 1-year-old baby, and she's saying to the doctor, "Did I pass this to my children?"
They told me specifically it was not hereditary.
31 years later, Joni walks into her nephew's hospital room.
I took one look at Billy, and I knew this had to be the same that my husband had.
Aunt Joni came to the hospital and she was clutching this binder. She said, "This is my husband's binder of his medical chart."
As we're reading this report, all we would have to do is take out the word Nathan and put in the word Billy. It was the fluids, the starving, the doctors, the uncertainty.
So now the family feels like they have some answer with this genetic connection, but it's of little comfort because they don't want Bill to suffer the same horrible death that Nathan had.
I think that for my father to realize he had what Nathan had was beyond what he was willing to even consider. Just felt scary, just felt like a death sentence.
And I think the reality of if it was him, then could it be his daughters?
My father would say, "I want to figure out what's wrong with me, even if I just find out what's wrong with me for my girls, for the rest of the family." So that's when Dr. Lynn got involved.
And he was a really incredibly smart pulmonologist. But what Dr. Lin was so good at was like medical mysteries. So he was on board to do whatever he could to try to help my dad feel better and figure out what was going on.
Dr. Lin had decided to put my dad on a fat-free diet.
There were a couple of soups, there were some fat-free dressings. A lot of the time he was just eating boiled vegetables that were pretty tasteless. The things that he loved, like pizza and ice cream and chicken McNuggets, were off the table.
Now, the fluid buildup that Bill had was made up of that chylous fluid. It was rich in fats and it was heavy. So by limiting the amount of fat that Bill ate, he, in essence, was limiting the amount of fat that wound up in the fluid, decreasing the flow and limiting the accumulation.
That was hard on him, but he was willing to do anything. We just were desperate. He was still making trips to the hospital. He was still not feeling well. He was still vomiting after every meal.
They didn't think that the fat-free diet was really working, so he just completely stopped.
My father was definitely going downhill. I was 20 and still trying to live my life, but then I come home and there was my dad laying in bed or sitting in his wheelchair, and it was heartbreaking. Definitely know he was scared.
Rhoda, it tapped every bit of her energy to take care of this man who not only was sick, but he was declining daily.
This was 1996, and the internet was very new. But Dr. Lin jumped on this new technology and went online to try to find other families suffering from the same symptoms. And he thought he found what he was looking for.
And he was the one who came up with that he possibly had this disease called Behçet's.
Behçet's disease is a rare multi-system disease that causes inflammation in blood vessels of all different sizes and can lead to a variety of symptoms. We think it's autoimmune, meaning that the body's immune system accidentally attacks healthy cells. We don't really know the underlying cause, but scientists do feel that there's a genetic component.
It's prevalent in a Jewish population in Turkey. It causes inflammation and swelling. And we were like, this is amazing. It just seemed like too good to be true.
We were hugging and we were just all ecstatic.
There isn't actually a cure, but doctors can help patients with their symptoms by putting them on different medications such as steroids.
Immediately, they put my dad on steroids. Dr. Lin was pretty sure we'd see some kind of change in the next 24 to 48 hours. But that time went by and nothing happened.
And it was devastating.
After that, there were no more ideas. Everyone felt hopeless.
My dad had been in the hospital. We were home having dinner, and Dr. Lin called and he said, you need to come right away. It's close.
When it is your turn.
Even if you knew it was coming,
Hi, Dad.
when it actually happens, feels like a guillotine.
The little beeps of the heart monitor wasn't going on anymore. It was just very quiet. And I just ran in and hugged him and cried, and I just tried to bring him back.
On Bill's autopsy, they found something shocking. It looked like his organs had fused together. But even this autopsy didn't bring them an official diagnosis. All they knew was that it was hereditary and it was horrible.
We realized we may have this disease. We may die of this.
Welcome back to Something's Killing Me. Dr. Bill Linder, a healthy man in his 40s, was stricken with a painful mystery disease. It caused his body to swell, made it difficult to breathe, and slowly starved him to death. After 4 frightening years, Bill died without ever knowing what was killing him. A connection between Bill's illness and the death of his uncle more than 30 years earlier offered hope that the family might finally get answers. But it also led to terrifying new questions. Was this illness genetic? And if it was, could they stop it before it killed someone else?
We realized we may have this disease. It may be with us. We need to find out what's going on because we may die of this.
One of the leading genetic researchers in the country, Dr. Christine Seidman, who worked at the Seidman lab at Harvard Medical School, heard about my father while he was still alive and came onto the case, and then stayed with it even after he died.
And both the heart murmur and that fluid accumulation were suggestive that there might be a primary heart muscle disorder as the basis for what was going on in the family. My research group did try and understand what had caused the disease in them. This could be genetic and have an etiology that is due to a change in the DNA.
We as humans have 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs. One pair comes from your mother, one from your father. On those chromosomes, there are genes. The genes are like the hard drive on the computer.
Mutations are subtle changes of DNA codes that can be really very insignificant, sort of like freckles on some people's faces, or they can be very profoundly impactful and damaging.
Every now and then, they can have absolutely dire consequences.
We first noticed the telltale sign of swelling in an old photograph of my great-grandmother May. May, born at the turn of the century in about 1898, grew up in New York City. May was about 36 when the swelling started in her arms. And then she also had it in her legs. They were calling it pleurisy because it was fluid in her lungs, which is one of the many symptoms of tuberculosis. Ultimately, my great-grandmother died of an infection. She was 55.
Bill's mother and his aunt both had ankle swelling. They didn't really think much of it because they were otherwise healthy senior citizens.
Bill died 4 to 5 years after being diagnosed with this lymphedema. His uncle died shortly after the swelling of various parts of his body, including around the belly. The fact that males can be more acutely affected than females leads to suggest that it may be X-linked.
We were able to deduce that part of the increased manifestations in men was due to the fact that it resides on an X chromosome. And so men have only one X chromosome, women have two. If you have a subtle abnormality of one X chromosome, you may have more serious manifestations than if you have two X chromosomes, one of which can help out the other one.
The only thing that all these people had in common, they all had a heart murmur. That was the connection.
We see this subtle but demonstrable heart murmur. And so we examined everyone in the family, not knowing who might be at risk and who was not.
She had asked as many of the living members of the family to come to Boston to be tested.
They were going to tell us if we had the gene based on whether or not we had a heart murmur.
We had aunts and uncles and cousins that tested positive for the gene.
I have the heart murmur. When the events happen and I start to fill up with fluid, at least I'll understand why.
And in some family members, we found heart murmurs, but not in most family members.
My sister and I had gone with our cousin Danny, and he didn't have it, and we were like all high-fived him because we were like, yeah, good one. We were brought into a room, separately. They attached electrodes to our chests, and then they also did an ultrasound at the same time to look and see if they could spot the physical heart murmur.
several members of the Linder family suffered from an undiagnosed fatal genetic disease. All the afflicted had a shared symptom, a functional heart murmur. Bill Linder's daughters, Jocelyn and Hillary, braced themselves for their test results.
I was 22 years old, and I'm getting tested for a gene that's going to impact my entire life, and I was terrified. They said immediately, there it is. Once I knew for sure that I had it, I suspected Hillary was probably gonna have it too.
The moment I found out, it was really scary. I have a heart murmur. Not only did I lose my father, but I have this gene as well.
We tried to stay positive, but it got harder as we started to see family members getting sicker. My dad died in 1996, and about 4 years later, his younger brother also started to show symptoms of this gene.
He looked exactly like my dad when my dad was really sick. He was thin, but yet had the distended stomach. He was extremely weak. He wasn't eating properly. He was getting tapped. He was throwing up. It was deja vu, and it was very upsetting.
He had a team of doctors sort of working separately to try to figure out what was going on, and unfortunately, they had no answers like everybody else. My uncle was sick for 2 years. He died in 2002. He was 54. When my uncle was sick, his aunt, my great aunt, had become sick in a similar way to my uncle.
My mother felt she knew what she was dying from, but knew also at the same time there was no real treatment.
I really just was tired of no answers, and I really wanted some, big answers. When you're talking about a disease that's taking lives,
the Harvard team then made a discovery that would change everything. They successfully identified and mapped the gene.
They figured out which gene on the X chromosome was causing all the problems that had killed my father.
It was very exciting for all of us. It gave us hope once again.
This is an important starting point when it comes to screening, diagnosis, and ultimately treatment. So few people have it, so it's hard to actually study what the long-term progression of it is.
I was flying on an airplane, and over the course of the flight, my foot started to really hurt. My foot had swollen so much that it was really just trapped in this shoe. And it was really alarming. I immediately called Dr. Seidman. I went to her offices, and like every other time, we did all the same tests we always did. But this time, she looks at me and she says, "I need you to promise me you won't throw up." And I was like, what does this mean? What is going on? She then explained that there was a blockage in the portal vein of my liver.
The portal vein, which is the major vascular pathway to the liver, brings in blood from the spleen, pancreas, gastrointestinal tract, and intestines. Jocelyn's father had a blocked portal vein, but so far, no other women had this symptom.
I was referred to a Dr. Samuel Siegel, who's considered one of the leading liver experts in the country.
She walked into the office with a binder of information, and she told me her story. I was confronted with a woman who appeared healthy, who had a very abnormal condition involving a very important vein.
In Jocelyn's case, the blockage were actually clots in her portal vein.
In the early states, they really are asymptomatic, but as the process continues, then they get bigger and bigger because more blood is going through them, and then they reach a critical point where they burst open and bleed. It's a life-threatening emergency.
The concern was if I threw up, they can burst. You can bleed out your entire blood supply. And so that was terrifying. I mean, that was life-changing.
I really didn't have a lot of symptoms at first. And then one day I had an MRI, and that's when I realized I do have varices in my stomach and in my esophagus that could be serious. Doctors were telling us horrible things like they're gonna rupture at any time and it's gonna kill you.
All of us were having sort of our own moments of terror over what was happening in our bodies. What they found or didn't find floored everybody.
Hillary and Jocelyn Linder were diagnosed with a rare genetic disease, the same one that killed their father, uncle, and several other family members. Knowing the disease is genetic and deadly brought with it a life-changing decision that could have repercussions for generations.
Over time, we were just living our lives. We both had careers, and we got married.
I was told early on that I couldn't have children the regular way or else I could pass it on. I was a carrier. So that was really scary.
Dr. Seidman had said to us repeatedly, when you want to have children, come see me.
I knew that we were going to need to start the process pretty soon after getting married because it's a process to do in vitro.
Because we had mapped the gene and Dr. Seidman could name where the gene was, she was able to work with an embryologist.
They had tested our embryos, and he put in 2 embryos, 2 healthy. We had twins, Addison and Billy, and they have been the loves of our lives ever since.
Even while we were living our lives, we were still trying to get as much information as we could. The lab has set about trying to find any family with the same symptoms as ours, or the gene itself, and what they found or didn't find floored everybody.
Dr. Seidman continued to research and try to find another group, another family, another person that had this same X chromosome situation. At some point, the realization was that it is only in this one family.
So it was just us. It was just our family.
Imagine being in this entire world and you're the only ones that have this awful disease that's killing your family members.
I've been in this molecular biology business for nearly 50 years. I don't know of one situation where a genetic disorder caused by one particular mutation was defined and localized to one particular family.
For a long time, they thought that that patient 0 was my great-grandmother May, until one day somebody pointed out a photograph in which May's mother, Esther Bloom, and her ankles are so swollen, she was patient 0. If she was patient 0, then this gene was 120 years old and had spread through 5 generations and had basically impacted 14 people.
And you can contrast this with other genetic diseases, such as cystic fibrosis, which first mutated about 52,000 years ago and then spread to over 3,600 generations. And now hundreds of thousands of people either have cystic fibrosis or are carriers for it.
A second family would be enormously helpful to understanding not only disease mechanisms, but how we can move forward towards thinking about treatments in this family.
We don't want anyone else in our family to get this. We're hoping that it ends with this generation.
You're up first.
Hillary's twins are now 10 years old, and even though they had an earlier test that showed they didn't carry the disease, Hillary wants to get them tested again just in case that first test wasn't right.
We knew it was a small chance that they had it because of the genetic in vitro. There was a chance for human error. There was a chance for other things to have gone wrong, that they could have had the gene. It's definitely been in my mind. I should get them tested. I hope they don't have it. I was definitely nervous getting that email. In fact, I waited a few hours to open it.
I mean, it's terrifying to think about my dad's grandchildren and their grandchildren suffering the way he did.
But when I finally did, I can breathe. Billy and Addison are completely healthy. They do not have the gene that it took my father and his brother, and I'm so relieved.
Today, there are like 26 kids in the 6th generation since our gene first mutated, and none of them has this gene. Like, that to me is so meaningful and so incredible and wonderful.
I hope to live a long time. I hope I get to watch my kids grow up. I hope I get to grow old with my husband. I hope to go on girls' trips with my sister. I just hope to have a long life.
50, 60 years ago, when my grandmother had it, no one knew what it was. Now they have an idea of what it is. So if maybe they can't cure us, maybe they'll be able to cure something else from their research. So there is a silver lining.
And I really felt so happy that we've come so far in medical genetics that maybe my dad was right to trust that someday we would have the answers, even if they weren't in his lifetime. They would maybe save the lives of his children. So that's pretty great.
7 living members of the family have the gene that killed Bill Linder. But now there is some hopeful news. The Seidman lab has discovered that asthma medication, which prevents airways from constricting, could slow down the progression of the disease. All affected members of the family now take asthma medication in the hope it will be one step on a long journey to finding a cure for this most unusual and devastating of illnesses. Thanks for joining us. Good night.